should not be eating like your ancestors. Social media's new favorite extreme diet is the so-called ancestral diet or animal-based diet. It comes in many different shapes and forms, and this one is going to raise a lot of questions the next time you pay a visit to your cardiologist. The main argument behind this diet is that our ancestors, the hunter-gatherers hundreds of thousands of years ago, did not have these crazy rates of non-communicable diseases such as obesity, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, etc. So following their eating pattern is going to magically improve your health and get it to what their level used to be. It is actually nothing new. The first time it made headlines was in the 1980s when it became known as the Paleolithic diet. Depending on who you ask, it might include different food groups and exclude different foods as well. Today's social media portrays the ancestral diet as a dietary pattern which includes only whole foods, and all types of processed products are off the list. The only things that make the cut are grass-fed beef, pasture-fed pork in some cases, wild-caught fish, beef tallow, butter in some cases, raw dairy, pasture-raised eggs, and some fruit to distinguish these people from the carnivores. You're also permitted to cook only with either beef tallow or with butter, and seed oils are completely off the lists, along also with any types of nuts and seeds. You know how this goes. It's because of the inflammation and the omega-6 fatty acids, yada yada. I have many videos talking about this. In order for you to understand where the problematic nature of this starts, I want to explain to you exactly what our hunter-gatherer ancestors used to do hundreds of thousands of years ago. By the way, the research papers that I read for the content that you're seeing today were very interesting, and they're all listed down in the description box if you want to read them for yourself. The first very common misconception about the hunter-gatherers is that they used to live only up until their 30s or latest to their 40s. I also used to think this way, but research proved me wrong. This is because the mean age of survival for these people was indeed somewhere in the 30s. This is because of statistical reasons. There was a very low rate of infant survival due to the very high likelihood that the infant would contract an infectious illness. That, however, does not mean that there were no hunter-gatherers that were living up until their 40s, 50s, even 60s. This was not very common, but that does not mean that it did not happen at all. It is very hard to make any assumptions as to what their body composition used to look like, simply because fat tissue and muscle tissue do not survive that long for today's humans to investigate them, but bone tissue does. So research has established that the bone density of our hunter-gatherer ancestors was actually the same as today's athletes, and on average their bones were much better developed compared to the ones of an average human today. We don't know if this is an evolutionary setback, the same way that we lose our wisdom teeth now and not everyone is born with them, or if this is because of the higher grade of physical activity that hunter-gatherers used to have. After all, bone tissue is not static, it's a dynamic tissue and it responds to stress. The amount of physical stress that hunter-gatherers had to endure is much greater than the one the average human does today. They were mainly living in nomadic communities, so they were on the go pretty much all of the time, and some research suggests that they had on average between 6 and 9 hours of walking per day. Some hunting practices were also quite extreme, such as running the prey until exhaustion. Some evidence on hunter-gatherer hunter-gatherer communities today, there are still some areas in the world where people have maintained this type of lifestyle. In these communities, the average body fat percentage of women is somewhere between 24 and 28%, and for men it's between 9 and 18%. This might seem to you as something pretty far from the ideal body type you see on social media. For women who have lost their menstrual cycle, according to evidence, a body fat percentage of 22% might be necessary for them to restore their period. Just putting this out there, it deserves a video on its own, to be honest. Now let's talk about the exact composition of the diet of our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Evidence suggests that they were actually mostly gatherers and not as much hunters, which is the opposite of what you've probably been made to believe. About 80% of the total amount of food consumed did indeed come from plant sources. And here we have basically any food group that they would find. We're talking about fruits, berries, tubers and roots, aka the ancient great-great-grandpas of today's potatoes, carrots, generous amounts of nuts and seeds. I hope that you heard this one. And the remaining 20% came from fish that they caught or from wild game. A very important aspect to mention is that our ancestors did not have the same food availability that we have today. They were not able to go to the grocery store. Most of the time, they were living in an energy deficit. Periods of famine with very limited amounts of energy consumed were not uncommon. This is also one of the reasons why their population was not able to grow so exponentially. It is also historically inaccurate and impossible to generalize about their dietary pattern of all of the different hunter-gatherer communities that were living at the time, since seasons, the climate, the biotype that they were living in were the main determinants of what they got to consume on the said day. Last but not least, our ancestors did not have all of the different new toxins and pollutants that we have today. I mean, we put those pollutants in the environment. They did not have to sit in an office for 8 hours. Their whole life pretty much was spent outdoors in the family community, if the whole community did indeed survive. One paper even emphasized how the presence of grandparents in the community contributed to an increase in the birth rate because they were able to take care of the infants while the younger adults were out there gathering food and resources. This was all very interesting, at least for me, I hope also for you. But now let's move into today's concept of an ancestral diet. I need to give it credit for a few things before I speak about the potential downsides. The first thing is that evidence does indeed suggest some benefits, especially in the short term, and specifically if one switches from a diet which consists mainly of ultra-processed foods. An ancestral diet, after all, comprises of only whole foods, which are pretty nutrient dense, especially if one consumes the organ meats that are also recommended. Organ meats are very high in B vitamins, in vitamin A, in minerals, which if one was consuming an ultra-processed diet prior to that, those might have been lacking. This is also what causes the huge improvements in skin appearance, in hair growth, in a lot of the people who choose to go on this regime. By eliminating the vast amounts of ultra-processed foods eaten prior, you would also not include some specific additives in the diet anymore. I'm talking about aspartame, so some artificial sweeteners. I'm talking about certain food dyes, certain additives that have been linked in scientific research to a lot of negative implications in your health. On a final note, grass-fed beef, wild-caught fish, pasture-fed pork, Those do indeed have somewhat better nutritional profiles, especially when talking about the fatty acid composition and certain micronutrients compared to their non-grass-fed counterparts. So the different price tag definitely amounts to something here. Those are pretty much all the potential benefits that I would attribute to this dietary pattern. So now it's time to move into where animal-based ancestral dieting falls short. Today's version of the ancestral diet is pretty heavy on red meats, on organ meats, on eggs, and all of those things, if consumed in excessive amounts, are going to lead to a rise in your blood cholesterol and also specifically the bad cholesterol that's in your blood, the one that has been associated many times in scientific research with the development of cardiovascular disease. This is due to the higher content of saturated fat and cholesterol in those specific food groups. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors, they, as already mentioned, did not have access to the grocery store, had to go out there and hunt their food. Therefore, they also did not have a stack with eggs on their plates at every single meal. And you also probably wouldn't eat like that if it involved going out there and putting your life at risk every single time. By limiting the amounts of plant foods to just fruits, you're technically going to be consuming a lot less fiber than what your ancestors did. Some evidence suggests that they were eating up to 100 grams of fiber per day. And fiber is the star of the show when we're talking about the gut microbiome, about the healthy digestion. On the trendy ancestral diet, in the form that it's presented, you would also not be going anywhere near those recommended 30 grams for optimal health. Consuming different types of fiber in good amounts has been linked time and time again in scientific research to better gut microbiome diversity, to lower inflammation, better digestion, so many different things. I have a whole playlist talking about gut health and multiple videos on fiber, so if you're interested, you can check that out later. You've probably gotten the idea by now that social media's representation of the ancestral diet is very historically incorrect. So just to add more fuel to the fire, I'm going to move into the raw dairy thing. The fact that I have to explain to anyone that consuming raw dairy could pose a threat to your health is very baffling to me. Pasteurization, this is by the way the process that milk undergoes before it makes it into the grocery store. It became more widely spread in the US in the times where tuberculosis was on the rise. And this is because about 10% of the cases of tuberculosis were indeed attributed to raw milk consumption. I mean, this issue is pretty much absent today, but there are a lot of other pathogens that could be present in the raw milk that you're consuming. There are multiple different pathways through which it could be infected, and it doesn't matter if you got it from the farm equivalent of Air 1. Even if the milk was tested prior to the farmer selling it to you, that doesn't guarantee that there are no pathogens present, since they could be living in the milk just in lower than detectable concentrations, but it could still be the effective dose depending on the bacteria. It's quite sad that due to misinformation, the cases of food poisoning due to raw dairy consumption are actually on the rise in the past decade or so in the US. Just so that you have an idea of the potential risks, I'm going to put a pretty recent example right here of what happens when you contract a certain bacterial strain. Additionally, any potential benefits that are rumored to be due to raw milk consumption, such as lower risk of asthma, of the development of certain allergies, or increased diversity of the gut microbiome and better immunity overall, those have not been proven in scientific research to actually be real. The pasteurization of milk, which is essentially just heating it up to a certain temperature, most of the time it's 72 degrees for a very short time. This is what pasteurization is. It makes sure that those pathogens are eliminated so that you don't have to go to the ER a few hours after consuming it. None of the nutritional value, or very little of it, is potentially lost during this process. I'm talking about protein content, vitamins, and all of that. The final potentially negative aspect of this dietary pattern is that it's not very cheap. It's not very cost effective if you're going to be getting grass-fed beef or other types of meat or wild-caught fish for every single meal. In today's economy, it's pretty unrealistic for the average consumer to be able to afford that. So in my eyes, a bit more financially well-off people could technically follow this dietary pattern. This is not really a surprise if you put it together with the rise of elite grocery stores such as Erewhon, which have made healthy eating look like something that is only reserved for the elite class, which is by no means anything close to the truth. There are in fact some processed products, processed foods that go a very long way if you want to improve your eating habits. Processed foods are different from ultra-processed foods. Even ultra-processed food would be, for example, a protein bar or some other type of snack that looks nothing like the original ingredients, whereas canned beans would be classified as a processed food simply because they're not in the natural form, the dry form that requires the whole cooking process. Pre-cooked beans in a package would technically also be a processed food. A lot of those things, for example, also frozen fruit packages, those could be very effective in terms of costs and nutritional value if you want to switch your diet to a healthier one. I'm a very big fan of canned legumes and also of frozen vegetables and fruit. I actually put only frozen fruit in my oatmeal. I don't really add any fresh ones because I'm too tired to cut them up in the morning. And they do not fall short in terms of nutritional value to the fresh ones. In texture, yes, but if you want to get all of the nutrients in, you would be doing pretty good with the frozen alternatives. All in all, you're not obligated to fall for every single new dietary pattern that gains popularity, and sticking to the basics is the wisest choice that you can make. Just ignore all of the noise and do what has been proven time and time again to work. And by that I mean eating primarily whole foods and eating all of the food groups in a balanced way and also not in excessively high amounts. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I hope that you enjoyed the contents of the video. Let me know if you did, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new from me. Also, leave down in the comments any suggestions that you have for future videos. Thank you again for being here with me, and I'll see you in the next one.